My name is Josephine Callahan. Everyone calls me Jo. I'm 42 years old. I work as an occupational therapist, which means I spend most of my professional life helping people relearn how to do ordinary things after something has broken the way their body used to work. Teaching patience, teaching people to trust small, incremental progress, even when the larger loss still feels too enormous to fully look at directly. That patience is the only reason I didn't scream when my mother-in-law, Rosalind, stood in the doorway of my husband's study 11 days after his funeral, directing two movers toward a stack of banker's boxes filled with his personal letters and journals, and said, without turning to look at me, "We're just being practical, dear. This part really isn't something that involves you the way it involves his own family." I stood in that hallway and watched strangers carry 22 years of my husband's handwriting toward a truck bound for a donation center, and I did the thing I do every single day at work with a patient who's lost something enormous and can't yet see any path back from it. I didn't argue in that raw, overwhelming moment. I found the one small, specific thing I could actually still control, and I acted on it quietly, without announcing what I was doing to anyone in that room. I pulled one box aside, the one nearest the door, told the movers I needed to check it for a document Simon's attorney required, and carried it, myself, out to my own car before anyone thought to stop me. What Rosalind didn't know, standing in that doorway, insisting none of this involved me, was that the box I'd saved held 11 years of letters my husband had written but never sent. To her, to his father, to me, along with a set of financial records that would, 7 months later, completely rearrange every assumption my in-laws had spent decades making about who actually owed what to whom in this family. If you've ever been told, in the rawest, most vulnerable days of your grief, that you didn't really belong to the person you just lost, stay with me to the end, because this one has a box of paper in it that changes everything. Subscribe and drop the word "kept" in the comments right now before we even begin. Let me take you back to the beginning, because you need the whole shape of my marriage and my in-laws and the specific, complicated love my husband carried for a family that never quite carried it back the same way, to understand exactly what that box actually protected. I met Simon Callahan when I was 29 at a mutual friend's dinner party, and I want to describe him honestly, because I think understanding who he actually was matters enormously for understanding everything that happened after he died. Simon worked as a corporate accountant for a mid-sized manufacturing firm, and he carried that same precise, methodical care into every part of his life outside of work. He kept meticulous records of nearly everything, not out of anxiety, but out of a genuine, almost tender belief that the details of a life were worth preserving carefully, the same way you'd preserve anything else you loved. He wrote letters, actual handwritten letters, to people he cared about, sometimes sending them, sometimes simply writing them and keeping them in a drawer, a habit, he told me, early in our relationship, he'd started as a teenager because he found he could say things on paper that he struggled to say directly, especially to his own parents. I want to describe our first several dates because I think they establish something important about who Simon actually was underneath his careful, orderly exterior. On our third date, at a small Italian restaurant neither of us had been to before, Simon arrived with a folded piece of paper he'd written the night before, not a formal letter exactly, just a short list of questions he genuinely wanted to know about me. Things like what I'd wanted to be at 7 years old, what the hardest thing about my childhood had actually been, what I hoped my life would look like at 60. I remember being disarmed by the specificity of it, the sense that he'd actually thought carefully about wanting to know me rather than simply making the usual, comfortable small talk most early dates run on. He told me, a little sheepishly, that he found conversation easier when he had something concrete to work from, that spontaneity sometimes made him anxious in a way that structure didn't. And I remember thinking, even that early, that I'd never met anyone who cared enough to actually prepare for getting to know someone. Simon's family, Desmond and Rosalind Callahan, came from a background considerably more comfortable than my own. Desmond had run a moderately successful architectural millwork business for most of his career, and the family had always carried itself with a specific, understated confidence I recognized, early on, as the particular ease of people who'd never had to seriously worry about money. I grew up differently, the daughter of a single mother who worked 2 jobs through most of my childhood. And while Simon's parents were never openly cruel about that difference, I understood, within the first several months of dating their son that I registered to them as somehow slightly beneath the life they'd imagined for him. I want to describe our courtship a little, because it matters for understanding the actual foundation Simon and I built together, separate from his family's careful reservations about me. Simon proposed after 2 years together in a small, unglamorous moment in our own kitchen on an ordinary Tuesday, because he told me he didn't want our engagement to become a performance for anyone else's benefit. He simply wanted me to know, as plainly and directly as possible, exactly how he felt. We were married the following year, in a modest ceremony his parents attended, but seemed, throughout, faintly uncomfortable at Rosalind commenting, more than once that day, on how different the wedding was from what she'd always pictured for her only son. A comment I understood, even then, as a small, specific withdrawal of full enthusiasm rather than outright rejection. Over the following 18 years of marriage, my relationship with Desmond and Rosalind settled into a pattern I came to recognize as its own particular kind of quiet exclusion. Not hostile, not overtly unkind, but persistently, consistently marked by a sense that I remained, in their eyes, an addition to Simon's life rather than a permanent, full member of their actual family. Rosalind would call Simon directly, rather than our shared line, for most family matters, a habit that persisted even after nearly 2 decades of marriage. She introduced me, at larger gatherings, simply as Simon's wife, a phrase technically accurate, but I noticed consistently offered without my actual name attached, as though the specific fact of who I was mattered less than my relational position to her son. I want to be fair to them, the way I've tried to be fair through this entire story. Desmond and Rosalind weren't monsters. They sent thoughtful gifts on our anniversary. They were, in their own careful, formal way, kind to me at holiday gatherings. But underneath that surface civility, there remained a specific, consistent current I never fully stopped noticing. A sense that if Simon had died first in some hypothetical, distant future they'd surely never seriously considered, I would revert, in their minds, to something closer to a former in-law than an actual, permanent daughter, someone whose claim to this family had always been understood, implicitly, as contingent on Simon's continued presence to vouch for it. I want to describe two specific memories from those 18 years, because I think they capture the texture of that exclusion more precisely than a general description ever could. The first happened at Simon's 40th birthday party, an event Rosalind organized in meticulous detail, down to a printed program listing family members expected to offer toasts. My name appeared on that program, but listed simply as Josephine, with no indication of my relationship to Simon at all, while every other name carried a clear relational label: brother, cousin, sister-in-law. I noticed it before the party started, standing in the kitchen helping set up, and I remember the specific, small sting of scanning that program and finding myself the only person in the entire room whose actual place in the family required no acknowledgement at all. The second happened 5 years before Simon died, when his childhood dog, a golden retriever named Baxter that Simon had grown up with and remained close to well into adulthood, passed away at Desmond and Rosalind's house. The family gathered for a small, informal memorial in the backyard, and Rosalind, speaking briefly about Baxter, mentioned everyone who loved this dog over the years by name. Simon, Desmond, herself, even a cousin who'd occasionally dog-sat. And, once again, simply omitted me, despite the fact that I'd known Baxter for the entire 18 years of my relationship with Simon and had genuinely loved that dog myself. I didn't say anything in the moment, standing at the edge of that small backyard gathering, but I remember, distinctly, the specific, cumulative weight of watching myself be quietly written out of yet another piece of this family's shared history, this time over something as small and as strange as a dog's memorial. Simon himself understood this dynamic with his parents far more clearly than I initially realized. And I want to describe a specific conversation we had roughly 8 years into our marriage, because it foreshadows everything that eventually happened after he died. We were lying in bed one night, and Simon, uncharacteristically, brought up his parents' treatment of me directly, something he rarely did, generally preferring to smooth over tension rather than confront it head-on. "I know they've never fully let you in," he said, quietly. "I've watched it for years, and I haven't done enough to push back on it, because I think some part of me has always been afraid of what it would cost, with them to really insist. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I've held on to every day since. I'm going to fix that eventually. Not by yelling at them, because that's not who I am. But I'm going to make sure, somehow, that it's never a question, for anyone, including them, that you're my actual family, completely, no matter what happens to either of us. I didn't fully understand, in that moment, what fixing it would eventually mean in practical terms. I understand now, looking back, that Simon had already begun, quietly, in his own careful, methodical way, building the exact protection that would eventually matter. I want to tell you about something significant that happened roughly 12 years into our marriage, because it's the second crucial piece of context you need before I can explain what happened after Simon died. Desmond's millwork business, which had provided the Callahan family's comfortable lifestyle for decades, ran into serious financial trouble during a broader downturn in the construction industry. A crisis Desmond, in the same proud, private way many people of his generation handle financial difficulty, kept largely hidden from extended family for as long as he possibly could. Simon found out, eventually, not from his father directly, but from a family friend who mentioned, in passing, that Desmond had been quietly seeking a business loan he'd been unable to secure through normal banking channels. Simon, methodical and financially disciplined throughout our marriage, had built a meaningful personal savings account over the years, separate from our joint household finances, money he'd set aside gradually from bonuses and careful budgeting. When he learned the actual severity of his father's situation, the business roughly 4 months from insolvency, a scenario that would have cost a dozen longtime employees their jobs and stripped his parents of most of their retirement security. Simon made a decision he discussed with me fully and transparently before acting on it. I want to describe that kitchen table conversation a little more fully, because I think it establishes something important about the deliberate, careful way Simon approached even the most emotionally charged decisions. He looked at me directly and said, "I want to offer him a loan, a real one, structured properly, not just money handed over informally that we'll both pretend never happened. I need you to be part of this decision, because it's real money, and because I don't want to do this without you fully understanding and agreeing to it." I want to be honest that I had real hesitations. In that moment, hesitations I voiced directly to Simon before we made any final decision. I reminded him, gently, of the specific pattern I'd lived inside for over a decade by that point. His parents' quiet, persistent distance from me, their tendency to treat our marriage as somehow secondary to Simon's continued closeness with them. Simon listened seriously, without becoming defensive, and said, "You're right to ask that. I don't have a perfect answer. But I'd rather help him properly, with real documentation protecting both of us, than let my resentment about how they've treated you cost 12 employees their jobs." He offered his father a personal loan of $150,000, structured formally, with a proper promissory note drafted by an actual attorney, at a modest but real interest rate, specifically because Simon, characteristically, wanted the arrangement to exist as an actual, documented obligation rather than a vague, sentimental family favor that might later be minimized or forgotten. I was present for the actual signing, at Simon's attorney's office, and I remember Desmond visibly emotional throughout, Rosalind quieter, more composed, though I noticed even then a specific discomfort in her expression I couldn't fully name at the time. Something closer to embarrassment than gratitude, as though the formal, documented nature of the loan was somehow an insult to the family's usual, informal way of handling things. I want to describe how Desmond and Rosalind received this loan, because it matters enormously for understanding what happened years later. They were, in the moment, deeply grateful, tearfully so, Desmond gripping Simon's hand at our kitchen table and calling him the son who saved this family. But over the following years, I watched a specific, familiar pattern unfold. The loan itself gradually receded from the family's active conversation, repayments arriving inconsistently and eventually stopping almost entirely roughly 4 years in, with vague explanations about getting back on track that never quite materialized into an actual, sustained repayment plan. Simon never pushed hard on it, largely, I think, out of the same instinct that had always made him reluctant to directly confront his parents about anything. But he kept meticulous records of every payment received and every payment missed, in the same careful, organized way he kept everything else that mattered to him. I want to describe one specific conversation Simon and I had about the loan, roughly 6 years after he'd made it, because it reveals something important about how he was actually thinking about the situation privately, even as he continued avoiding a direct confrontation. We were reviewing our own household budget one evening, and Simon mentioned, almost offhandedly, that he'd updated his loan records again. Payments now more than 2 years behind schedule. I asked whether he intended to ever raise it directly with his father. He was quiet a long moment before answering. "I think about it constantly," he said. "But every time I picture the conversation, I picture my mother making it about how ungrateful I'm being for even mentioning it, rather than about the actual money. I've decided the records matter more than the conversation, for now. I want the truth to exist somewhere solid, even if I'm not ready to say it out loud yet." Simon died 4 years ago, suddenly, of a cardiac arrhythmia nobody had known he carried, at 47 years old, collapsing at his desk at work on an entirely ordinary Wednesday afternoon. I won't dwell extensively on the immediate aftermath of that loss, except to say that grief, in those first weeks, moves through you in a way that makes even simple decisions feel enormous, and that I was, in every practical sense, entirely unprepared for how quickly Desmond and Rosalind would move to assert control over pieces of Simon's life I'd assumed, naively, would remain fully within my own province to manage. I want to describe the funeral itself briefly, because certain moments from it took on new, retrospective meaning once I understood, months later, exactly what had already begun happening beneath the surface of that difficult day. Rosalind planned much of the service herself, efficiently and with genuine care for honoring Simon's memory. And I want to be fair and say that in the immediate, acute grief of that week, I was, in many ways, grateful for her taking on logistics I had no capacity to manage myself. But I remember noticing, even then, a specific pattern in how she made decisions. Consulting Desmond, consulting Simon's cousin Meredith about certain details, and consulting me only on the narrowest, most procedural questions, as though my actual input on how to honor my own husband's memory mattered less than everyone else's. At the reception following the service, an elderly family friend, meaning well, approached me and said, gently, "You must be so grateful Rosalind is handling everything. It's such a relief when someone else can carry that weight." I remember not having the emotional capacity, in that moment, to explain that I hadn't actually been asked whether I wanted that weight carried for me, that grief had simply moved fast enough, and my own shock had been disorienting enough, that decisions had been made around me before I'd fully found my footing to participate in making them myself. The specific incident that opens this story happened 11 days after the funeral, when Rosalind called to say she and Desmond wanted to come by to help sort through some of Simon's things. A request I agreed to, still deeply disoriented by grief, without fully anticipating what sorting through would actually mean in practice. I want to describe that afternoon in detail, because every part of it still sits vividly, painfully clear in my memory, even 4 years later. Rosalind and Desmond arrived with 2 movers they'd hired themselves, without mentioning this detail to me in advance, and moved, within the first 20 minutes, directly toward Simon's home study. A small, book-lined room off our bedroom where he'd kept, for our entire marriage, an extensive collection of journals, correspondence, and personal papers, meticulously organized in the same careful way he organized everything else in his life. I remember standing in the doorway, watching the movers begin pulling bankers' boxes down from shelves, and asking, as calmly as grief allowed, what exactly they were planning to do with everything. I want to describe that room a little, because I think it matters for understanding the specific violation of watching it dismantled without my consent. Simon had built that study over years, shelves he'd installed himself on a weekend early in our marriage, a specific reading chair positioned exactly where the afternoon light fell best, a small collection of framed photographs on his desk. Our wedding, a hiking trip we'd taken in our 30s, a candid shot of the two of us laughing at something neither of us could remember afterward, taken by a stranger who'd offered to snap a photo on an anniversary trip. Watching movers move briskly through that specific, carefully built space, treating its contents as generic clutter to be sorted rather than the physical architecture of an entire shared life, remains one of the most disorienting sensations I've ever experienced. Rosalind's response is the sentence that opens this story. "We're just being practical, dear. This part really isn't something that involves you the way it involves his own family. She said it without fully turning to look at me, her attention already redirected toward directing the movers, as though the actual content of what she'd just said required no particular acknowledgement or pause. I remember, in that specific moment, feeling something in my chest go both hot and strangely, unexpectedly calm. The particular sensation of a boundary being crossed so plainly that some deeper, steadier part of you simply takes over from the part that would otherwise be screaming. I want to describe the specific, disorienting shock of that moment because I think it's important for understanding why my response in the immediate aftermath was so quiet rather than confrontational. I had been married to Simon for 18 years. I had built an entire adult life alongside him, in that house, in that study, surrounded by exactly the papers now being loaded into boxes by strangers his mother had hired without consulting me. And in the rawest, most vulnerable 11 days of my entire life, my mother-in-law had just told me, plainly, that this, his own handwriting, his own private thoughts, simply wasn't mine to have any say over. I did the thing I do every single day at work with a patient facing a devastating, disorienting loss. I didn't try to fight the entire overwhelming situation at once, in that moment, in front of strangers, while my own grief was still too raw to trust my own reactions. I found the one small, specific thing I could actually still control. I noticed, as the movers worked, one particular banker's box near the study door, one I recognized, from years of watching Simon organize his things, as the box containing his oldest, most personal correspondence. Letters he'd written over decades, many never sent, tucked away in a drawer I'd occasionally glimpsed but never fully gone through myself, out of respect for whatever private processing he'd needed that drawer for. I want to describe the specific, split-second calculation that went through my mind in that moment, because I think it reveals something about how grief and instinct can work together in ways that surprise you. I wasn't thinking, consciously, about legal rights or future confrontations. I was thinking, the way I think at work when a patient's entire rehabilitation plan suddenly needs to be reassessed in real time, about triage, about which single thing, out of an overwhelming, uncontrollable situation, I could actually still act on right now, in this exact minute, before the window to act on it closed entirely. That specific box, sitting nearest the door, was the answer that presented itself, and I moved toward it before I'd even fully finished the thought. I told the movers, quietly, that I needed to check that particular box first, that Simon's attorney had mentioned needing to review some of his personal files as part of settling the estate. A small, plausible lie that nobody in the room thought to question, given the general chaos and grief of the afternoon. I carried that box, myself, out to my car, and I did not open it again for nearly 7 months. I want to be honest about why I waited so long before finally going through its contents. Part of it was simple, ordinary grief. I genuinely wasn't emotionally prepared, for a long time, to sit with decades of my husband's private handwriting, knowing I'd never again hear his actual voice reading any of it aloud. But part of it, I think, was also a kind of protective instinct. A sense that whatever was in that box needed to be approached carefully, patiently, the way you approach any significant, potentially difficult recovery. Not rushed into out of anger or urgency, but engaged with slowly on its own timeline. I finally opened the box on what would have been Simon's 48th birthday, 7 months after his death, sitting alone at our kitchen table on a quiet Sunday morning. What I found, over the following several hours, rearranged nearly everything I understood about the final years of Simon's relationship with his parents. The box contained dozens of letters, some sent and later returned to him in copies he'd made for his own records. Many never sent at all, written across nearly 2 decades. Several were addressed to me, tender, ordinary love letters from various points in our marriage that I read slowly, allowing myself to cry as much as I needed to. But a significant portion of the letters were addressed to his parents, drafts, and copies of correspondence spanning years, revealing a far more complicated, more clear-eyed relationship with Desmond and Rosalind than Simon had ever fully described to me directly. One letter, dated roughly 2 years before he died, addressed to his father but apparently never sent, read, in part. I need you to understand that the loan isn't something I'm ever going to bring up directly, because I don't want money to become the thing that defines our relationship. But I also need you to understand that I've kept every record carefully, not because I don't trust you, but because I believe obligations matter, and because I want, someday, for the actual truth of what happened between us to exist somewhere honest, even if we never speak of it directly ourselves. Another letter, this one addressed to Rosalind and dated roughly 18 months before he died, was more direct and more painful to read, because I understood, reading it, exactly how clearly Simon had seen the dynamic I'd lived inside for 18 years, and how much it had actually cost him to watch it happen. "Mom," he wrote, "I need you to hear something directly, because I don't think you fully understand how it lands when you call me instead of calling our house, or when you introduce Jo without her name attached, like she's a role rather than a person. I love you. I'm not writing this to punish you. But I need you to know that if anything ever happened to me, I would need you to treat Jo exactly the way you'd treat me. Not as someone connected to this family through me, but as someone who simply is this family, completely on her own terms. I think about this more than you'd probably guess. I want to make sure it's actually true, not just something I assume will work out." I want to describe sitting with that letter because I don't think I can adequately convey, in a brief summary, what it actually felt like to read it for the first time. I sat at our kitchen table for nearly an hour afterward, unable to move, understanding, all at once, several things simultaneously, that Simon had seen, with total clarity, exactly the dynamic I'd lived inside for 18 years, that he'd cared enough to try, even if imperfectly, to address it directly with his mother. And that some part of him, writing that letter, had already been quietly anticipating a future where I might need this kind of protection, years before either of us had any reason to think his own death was approaching. There was a third letter in the box that I want to describe, because it changed something in how I understood Simon's relationship with his own grief and his own mortality. Dated roughly 1 year before he died, addressed simply, "To whoever eventually reads this," it read, in part, "I don't know when or if anyone will ever find these letters. I write them because I think better on paper than I do out loud, and because some part of me has always understood that the people I love most deserve a record of how I actually felt, not just my imperfect, halting attempts to say it in person. If you're reading this, Jo, and something has happened to me, I need you to know that 18 years with you has been the actual center of my entire life. More than my career, more than anything I ever built professionally. More, even, than my complicated relationship with my own parents. I've tried to protect what we built in every way I know how. I hope it was enough. I hope you never have to find out the hard way whether it was." I read that particular letter more times than I can count in the months that followed, and I want to be honest that it remains, even now, the single piece of writing I return to most often on my hardest days. I sat with that letter for a very long time, understanding, finally, fully, exactly how much Simon had seen, and exactly how much he'd been quietly, carefully working, in his own methodical way, to protect me from a dynamic he understood better than I'd ever fully realized he did. The box also contained, in a separate, carefully labeled folder, the complete financial records of the loan he'd made to his father 12 years earlier. The original promissory note, a full ledger of payments received and missed, and a final entry, dated roughly 6 months before Simon died, showing an outstanding balance, with accrued interest, of $91,400 still owed. By Desmond, a debt that had never been formally forgiven, discharged, or even acknowledged in any of the family's ongoing conversations since Simon's death. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because I think the specific shape of my response, once I understood everything the box actually contained, matters enormously for understanding how this story eventually resolved. I didn't call Desmond and Rosalind immediately, confrontationally, in the raw emotional aftermath of finally reading everything. I sat with the material for several more weeks, consulting quietly with Simon's estate attorney, a careful, thorough woman named Priya Anand, who confirmed that the promissory note was, in fact, a legally valid, enforceable debt, one that had technically become part of Simon's estate upon his death, meaning I, as his sole heir and executor, held the legal right to formally collect on it, regardless. of whatever informal understanding Desmond and Rosalind might have quietly assumed had simply evaporated along with their son. I want to be honest about my reasoning here, because I think it's the actual heart of this story, and I don't want to present it as a simple, satisfying act of financial vindication, because it genuinely wasn't that clean or comfortable, even for me. I had spent 18 years accepting Desmond and Rosalind's quiet, persistent exclusion, largely in silence, out of love for Simon and a genuine, if sometimes exhausted, willingness to preserve family peace. Their behavior in the days immediately following Simon's death, dismissing my right to even his private letters, treating me as someone whose grief and whose claim to his life simply didn't extend to the actual, full weight of who he'd been, was, I came to understand, the clearest possible confirmation that nothing had actually changed in how they saw me, regardless of 18 years of marriage. The opportunity to formally address everything came roughly 2 months later, at a family meeting Desmond and Rosalind themselves requested, ostensibly to discuss finalizing some remaining details of Simon's estate. A meeting I later understood they'd called specifically because they'd heard, through a cousin, that I'd been going through some old boxes and wanted, I think, to get ahead of whatever that might mean before I raised it myself. I want to describe the days leading up to that meeting because I spent a significant amount of that time deciding, carefully, exactly how I wanted to handle whatever was coming. I called Priya Anand, Simon's estate attorney, and walked through the full situation with her. The letters, the loan documentation, the pattern of exclusion I'd lived inside for 18 years. Priya listened carefully and then told me something that helped me approach the meeting with more clarity than I might otherwise have managed. "You don't have to decide today whether you're going to formally collect on this debt," she said. "But you should walk into that room today knowing exactly what you're legally entitled to, so nobody in that family can quietly convince you otherwise, the way it sounds like they've been doing for 18 years about other things." We met at their house, a setting I noted, even in the moment, as a small, telling choice. Desmond and Rosalind clearly wanting whatever conversation was coming to happen on their own territory rather than mine. Several extended family members were present as well, aunts and cousins who'd been invited, I suspect, both for genuine family reasons and, perhaps, as a subtle form of social insulation, a room full of witnesses who might make any difficult confrontation feel less comfortable to initiate. I recognized my sister-in-law, Simon's cousin Meredith, seated near the back, someone I'd always liked, and I remember feeling a small, specific comfort in at least one familiar, warm face in a room otherwise arranged, I suspected, to make my position feel isolated. Rosalind opened the conversation smoothly, gracefully, expressing continued sympathy for my loss before pivoting, within a few minutes, toward the actual purpose of the gathering. "We wanted to talk," she said, "about Simon's finances, honestly. He was still figuring a lot of that out. Poor thing. We practically ran the family's finances together for years, and I think there might be some misunderstandings about what was actually his to leave versus what was always more, informally, a shared family resource. I want you to understand exactly what that sentence was actually doing, because I recognized it immediately for what it was. An attempt, delivered gently, in front of witnesses, to quietly reframe 18 years of my husband's careful, independent financial discipline as some kind of confused, informally shared family arrangement, one vague enough to potentially blur the very clear, very documented reality I now held in a folder in my bag. Comment the word "kept" right now if you've ever watched someone try to rewrite a history you already had documented proof of. Because that's the exact moment this story turns. I did the thing I do every day at work with a patient trying to convince themselves a difficult reality isn't quite what it actually is. I didn't argue in the moment with raised emotion. I opened my bag, quietly, and set the folder on the coffee table between us. "I think there might be some misunderstandings, too," I said, evenly. "I found some things going through Simon's study. I think it's time we all actually looked at them together." I walked the room through it plainly. The letters, several of which I read excerpts from aloud, including the one addressed directly to Rosalind about how she'd need to treat me if anything ever happened to Simon. I watched her face go pale, then flushed, several relatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats as Simon's own written words, from years earlier, addressed the exact dynamic currently unfolding in that very room. Then I laid out the loan documentation. The original promissory note, Desmond's own signature clearly visible, the full ledger of payments, the outstanding balance of $91,400 still legally owed to Simon's estate. I want to describe Rosalind's reaction specifically because it unfolded differently than Desmond's, and I think the contrast matters. Where Desmond went quiet, staring at his own signature, Rosalind's first response was defensive, sharp. "That letter doesn't mean what you're implying, it means," she said, her voice tight. "Simon loved this family. He wasn't writing some kind of formal accusation against me." I told her, calmly, that I agreed he loved this family completely, and that the letter wasn't an accusation. It was a request. A request she'd apparently never actually honored in the 2 years since he'd written it, and certainly not in the 11 days after his death, when she'd stood in his own study telling me none of it involved me. Meredith, seated near the back of the room, spoke up at this point, quietly but clearly. "Aunt Roz," she said, "I was at Simon's 40th birthday party. I remember the program. Joe's name was on there without anything next to it, while the rest of us all had our relationships listed. I always thought that was strange, and I never said anything, and I think I probably should have. I hadn't expected anyone else in that room to corroborate anything I'd experienced, and I remember feeling a small, unexpected steadiness at hearing someone else name a piece of the pattern I'd lived inside for so long." Desmond, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire gathering up to that point, went very quiet, staring at his own signature on a document he'd clearly hoped, in some unexamined corner of his mind, had simply dissolved along with his son's death. "I didn't think," he said, finally, his voice unsteady. "I didn't think you'd actually have all of this." I don't think I ever really let myself think about it directly at all. "I know," I said, not unkindly. "I think that's exactly the problem. None of you ever really let yourselves think about any of this directly. Not the loan. Not how you've treated me for 18 years. Not what Simon actually wanted, which he wrote down, carefully, more than once. Because I think some part of him already knew he might need to say it in writing eventually, since saying it out loud to your faces never seemed to fully land." Rosalind, quieter now, asked the question I think actually mattered most in that entire room. "What do you want from us, Joe? Do you want the money? Do you want an apology? I don't know what this meeting is actually supposed to accomplish now." I thought carefully before answering, because I wanted to give her something true rather than something simply satisfying to say in the moment. "I want the loan repaid, properly, because that's simply what's owed, and pretending otherwise doesn't honor what Simon actually built," I said. "But more than that, I want you to actually read what your own son wrote to you, more than once, and sit with it, instead of deciding it doesn't mean what it plainly says. I've spent 18 years being polite about how this family has treated me. I'm not interested in being polite about it anymore. I'd rather be honest, even if honest is harder for all of us to sit with today. I want to be honest about what happened in the weeks and months that followed, because I don't think this story resolves into a simple, comfortable ending, and I don't think it should." Desmond, to his credit, arranged a formal repayment plan for the outstanding loan within a month, working with Priya to structure it properly, a plan he has, in the years since, actually maintained consistently. Rosalind's response was more complicated and slower. An initial period of wounded, defensive silence followed, gradually, over the following year, by something closer to genuine, if imperfect, reckoning. I want to describe one specific conversation with Rosalind, roughly 8 months after that family meeting, because I think it captures something true about how this eventually, partially resolved. She called me, unprompted, and asked if we could talk. "I read that letter again," she said, referring to the one Simon had written her, which I'd given her a copy of. "I've read it probably 20 times since that day. I keep trying to understand how I could have loved my son as much as I did and still made him feel like he needed to write something like that down, just in case. I don't have a good answer for that. I think I just assumed love was obvious enough that it didn't need to be demonstrated in the specific ways he was asking for." I told her, honestly, that I appreciated her saying that, and that I thought it mattered, even this late. I didn't tell her that I thought obvious enough that it didn't need to be demonstrated was, in some sense, the entire disease underneath everything that had happened. A comfortable assumption that spared her the actual, specific work of ever having to show it. I think she understood that implication anyway, without my needing to say it directly. Rosalind and I have built something real in the years since, though I want to be honest that it remains, even now, more careful and more effortful than the easy warmth I sometimes see in other families. She uses my name now, consistently, in every setting. She calls me directly, as often as she calls anyone else in the family, for ordinary things. A recipe, a piece of news, nothing significant, which is, I've come to understand, exactly the point. Ordinary inclusion, repeated consistently, matters more than any single, dramatic gesture ever could. I want to describe one more specific moment because I think it captures something about how far this relationship has actually come. Last year, at a small gathering for what would have been Simon's 51st birthday, Rosalind stood to say a few words, the way she often does at family occasions. And this time, without any prompting from me, she included me directly and by name in her remembrance of her son. Not as an afterthought, not as Simon's wife, but as Jo, who loved my son more consistently and more patiently than I. Think any of us fully understood while he was alive to see it. I cried, standing in that room, not out of any residual anger, but out of the specific, complicated grief of finally receiving something I'd needed for 18 years, arriving 4 years too late for Simon himself to witness it. Desmond, for his part, has become, unexpectedly, someone I speak with more openly than I ever did while Simon was alive. The formal repayment process, ironically, giving us regular, structured reasons to be in contact that gradually softened into something closer to genuine warmth. He told me, once, during one of our periodic calls to review the loan's remaining balance, that going through this process had actually changed how he thought about his own relationship with his father, decades earlier, and the informal, undocumented ways money had moved through his own family growing up, never fully acknowledged or resolved. I think I learned some bad habits early, he said, about what it means to actually take responsibility for what you owe someone, financially or otherwise. I'm grateful Simon didn't learn them from me. I wish I'd learned them from him instead. Desmond finished repaying the full outstanding balance, with interest, just over 3 years after that family meeting. A final payment he insisted on delivering to me in person rather than simply transferring electronically, along with a short, handwritten note of his own, the family habit apparently having skipped a generation and landed, quietly, back where it started. I kept Simon's letters, all of them, in a proper archival box now, acid-free, carefully organized, in the same study where they were nearly carried away 11 days after his funeral. I read them still, occasionally, on difficult days, and I've come to think of that box not simply as a collection of his handwriting, but as the actual, physical proof of something I sometimes still struggle to fully believe on my hardest days. That I was seen, completely and specifically, by the person who mattered most, even in the ways he never quite managed to say out loud while he was still here, to say them. Here's what I want you to take from this. If you've ever had someone try to diminish your claim to a person you loved and lost, treating your grief as somehow smaller or less legitimate than theirs, the people who actually loved you leave proof, whether they mean to or not. In the way they wrote about you, in the plans they quietly made to protect you, in the small, careful things they did specifically because they understood, better than anyone else, exactly what you might eventually need. Grief doesn't erase that proof. Sometimes it just takes time, and the right box, finally opened, to find it. Comment the word "kept" one more time if you made it all the way to the end. I want to know exactly who stayed with me for this whole story. Subscribe to Pieces of Us. They threw away my husband's letters. They just never thought to check which box I'd already carried out to my car.